Okay, we're going to talk about the influence of Jewish migration on America today. All right, Jewish immigration to the States came in waves. Okay, we had Jewish people here from colonial times. All right, but they didn't have any influence, and there weren't enough of them so that nobody really paid any attention to them. And this was considered a Protestant country. It's founded by Protestants. Its documents were written by Protestants or shirt-tail Protestants. I mean, Thomas Jefferson wasn't really, well, he was more Protestant than Catholic, but he was really neither one, okay? But he was more influenced by Protestantism. But there were waves of Jewish immigration that took place. The first one, in mid-19th century, there was Jewish migration from German-speaking Central Europe. Okay, a large number of Jews came in during that period of time. But that episode was dwarfed by the massive immigration from Eastern Europe that took place in the 1880s and increased from there rapidly through the 1910s. Okay, so there's 30 years of rapid Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. Now, why were they coming here from Eastern Europe? Persecution. That's exactly right. Places like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, places like that. Okay. So they came here, all right? 2 million Jews entered the United States during those years. A third, much smaller but highly influential wave of Jewish immigrants came in the 1930s, and of course you can guess as to why that was, because Hitler had control over the entire continent with the exception of Great Britain. Okay. All right, so what became of all these Jewish people? Well, in 1920, 1/5 of the population of our biggest city was Jewish, New York. 1/5. Okay, and it's still, I mean, for a long time, people said there are more Jews in New York than there are in Israel. I don't know if that's still the case or not, but it used to be the case. Yeah. Okay, and since New York was the cultural and financial capital of the United States, obviously the contribution of Jewish people would have an outsized influence because they got involved in finance, in culture. Think of Leonard Bernstein, for example, who conducted the New York Philharmonic, and a lot of these people who were intellectuals taught at New York University or Columbia, which is also in New York. Okay, and Abraham Heschel taught at the rabbinical school in New York. So they played a very influential role in American life. And it included business, entertainment, science, philosophy. A lot of them went into social work. Psychology had a big influence on psychology. Labor unions, they were all over the U.S. in terms of its cultural institutions. By the time we get into the post-World War II period, Jewish influence in America was so great that America had to redefine itself. Prior to that time, America always thought of itself as a Christian nation. After that period of time, we call ourselves a what? Judeo-Christian nation. Exactly. That's where that term came from. We had to revise the whole thing about our identity. Okay? A very famous book came out in 1955, the year of my birth. Big, important year. It was called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. And the point of the book was that America is no longer a Protestant nation. We have Protestants, but just as influential are Catholics and Jews. Okay? So our identity now is Judeo-Christian, not just Christian. Okay? And of course, since then, there's been rapidly the influence, which started, you know, in the 60s with the hippies, influence of Hindu and Buddhist religious traditions and other Eastern traditions as well, although none of them are even close to these three. These are the three biggies in terms of the religions that shaped America into what it is today. All right, well, what about Catholic immigration? There was also a lot of Catholic immigration. For example, the biggest wave of Catholic immigration came first from Ireland for two reasons. Number one, there was a what there? The potato famine, right? Okay, well, here's the thing though. There was enough food in what we now call the UK to feed those people. But England had all the power and they held on to it, and that was the beginning of the big, huge crisis between Ireland and England. All right. The Irish believed that English rule was oppressive, aristocratic and oppressive. Okay, so they came here in growth. Even before the Civil War, large numbers of Irish came here. And because the Irish tended to understand the Confederacy in ways that are similar to the way they understood Britain, in other words, an aristocratic country, right? In the old antebellum South, who were the aristocrats? The plantation owners. That's right. They had all the power. All right? There were other white people. Most white people in the old South did not own slaves. They couldn't afford to buy a slave. A slave cost upwards of $1,800. So the planters owned the slaves. So the poor whites, by and large, did not own slaves. They had small little farms. They barely eked out a living. Anyway, the Irish saw that aristocratic society in the South as being similar to England. And so they joined the Union Army in huge numbers. They fought in massive battles. There was a huge Irish brigade that fought at Gettysburg in a famous part of the battle called the Wheat Field. If any of you have ever been to Gettysburg, you're familiar with the Wheat Field. The Wheat Field was a place where there was an enormous amount of violence and fighting going on, and thousands of soldiers died in the wheat field. I think the Irish lost upwards of 80% of their brigade, or corps, or whatever it was called. And there's a famous statue of an Irish priest in Gettysburg. So what the Irish priest did before the battle is he had all the soldiers kneel in front of him, and he gave them absolution before the battle, so that all their sins were forgiven before they might not make it through.
Oh boy.
And the Protestants who were fighting with them were actually quite impressed. They kneeled with their Catholic soldiers. Yeah. Yeah, when you're talking about, you know, the kind of carnage that took place in the battle at Gettysburg, you know, yeah. Okay, so there were Catholics from Ireland, but there were also Catholics that came from Italy, and yeah, some from France, not a lot, more from southern Germany. Now, southern Germany is Catholic. Bavaria. Okay, so why did the Catholic population, which I think was actually larger than the Jewish population in America, why did they not flourish in the same numbers that the Jewish population did? Well, if you're an Orthodox Jew, it's the same thing. You have as many kids as possible. But you know, the Orthodox Jews, they created their own little neighborhoods, particularly in Brooklyn, and isolated themselves from the rest of the population to preserve their culture. Okay. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the Jewish population, even the impoverished Jewish population that came to this country from other parts of the world, already had high rates of literacy. They could read and write, they had an education. The people that came from the Catholic countries did not. Yeah. Which was why, number two, when the Jewish immigrants came here, they came here with the intention of making this their permanent home. The Catholic immigrants from places like Italy and Ireland, fully 1/4, I think, it's either 1/4 or 1/3, went back. They went back. They came over here, they worked for a while, they made some money, and they went back. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, they didn't come here for a home. They came here to make some money. Okay, similar to, I think, some of the people who pick grapes up in Sonoma and Napa. They migrate from Mexico, they make a bunch of money, and they go home again. You know, when the grapes are picked. Okay, so there were single males from among the Catholic countries who would come here. The Jewish immigrants, it was the whole family. They brought mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, and all the kids. And maybe the aunts and uncles as well. Okay, so the whole crew came with them. So part of the reason that we looked at two of the reasons why they flourished. Number one was where they settled. They settled in places where there was just plain a lot of influence, like New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., places like that, all right? And Los Angeles, too, okay? Secondly, they were literate. They came here with an education. Thirdly, some of them, especially the ones who came here in the 30s, were already famous for their achievements. Albert Einstein, for example, is the most obvious case there. So, you know, and Oppenheimer and some of the scientists, their education, they got their education and learned how to do their scientific pursuits in Europe. And then when the Nazis took over and they knew that they were in danger if they stayed there, they came here. All right. And of course, now the U.S. Prior to World War II, the U.S. wasn't really interested in taking in a lot of Jews. Did you know that? There was one boat filled with Jewish immigrants that was not allowed to dock in the U.S. They had to turn around and go back. But if you were Albert Einstein, oh sure, come on in, no good, happy to have you. So, where did Albert Einstein settle, do you know? I used to go to his house all the time.
Maryland?
No.
Florida?
Princeton, New Jersey. Princeton, New Jersey. Did you?
Yeah.
There was what was called the Center for Advanced Studies in Princeton, and he went there to. Here's what he was trying to do. Okay, as you might know, Albert Einstein wrote 2 papers when he was a patent office clerk in Switzerland. He wasn't even a famous scientist yet. And he wrote 2 papers that created the theory of relativity. Okay? Now, the theory of relativity is very complicated, and I'm not going to try to explain it to you because I don't fully understand it. Except to say that he connects space and time such that if you understand it properly, you understand that we live in a 4-dimensional universe, because time is one of the dimensions and space has 3 dimensions. What Einstein came here to do was to try to figure out the relationship between the theory of relativity and the theory of quantum mechanics. That's what he came to do. And he wasn't successful. He couldn't do it. Okay. So that gives you a little idea of the degree to which Jewish Americans have had an influence on American science, intellectual life. The names that we went through helps you to understand that a little better. Some statistics. In 1970, 40% of the partners in major law firms in New York and Washington, D.C. were Jewish. 40%. They had a major influence on social work, psychology, academia, political advocacy. Do you know who the people were who went out and protested during the Civil Rights Movement for a Voting Rights Act? Jews. Who were the women that were in charge of second-wave feminism? Jews. Okay, is there a way to understand why Jews have been so involved in political advocacy and issues of justice in society? Well, there is. It's all over the Hebrew prophets. Read any Hebrew prophet. What do they say to the ancient Israelites? God is mad at you because you're ignoring the poor, you're worshiping money, you're trying to get rich, you cheat people who can't afford to be cheated, but let justice roll down. Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech, you know who he quoted? The prophet Amos. Yeah. Okay, so whether you're a practicing Jew or a secular Jew, this is a part of your culture. This is what has shaped who you are as a Jew. Because even if you're a secular Jew, you're an ancestor of those people who wrote the Old Testament. This is your ancestry, right? Okay, so secular, practicing Jews have that in common. Involved in social justice issues. Okay.
Isn't it maybe because they were discriminated against?
Oh, I'm sure that had an effect on it too. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And let me say that when the Jewish people came here in the 1880s and 90s and even into the 1920s, it's not like the Protestant population of America, which was the vast majority. The vast majority of people were members of Lutheran, Methodist, Presbyterian, Congregational, Church of Christ. That's where the vast majority of Americans were. Yes, there were Catholics too, but they tended not to be heavily involved in American politics until which president? JFK, exactly. Took a long time to get Catholic in the White House. You know who was in the White House all the way up till 1960? A Protestant. Everyone. Yeah. This was a Protestant country.
Well, we haven't had a Jewish president.
No, we haven't. Not yet.
Not even a vice president.
Not that I know of. Oh, I know who you're talking about. Yeah, he's from Connecticut, I think. He was the running mate of the guy from Tennessee who lost to George Bush.
Al Gore.
Al Gore. He was his running mate. Yeah. Anyway, speaking of politics, in the 1920s there were no Jews in Congress. By 1970, there were 10 Jewish senators. Okay, now keep in mind, each state gets 2 senators, right? So there's 100 of them. It's easy to keep track of the Senate. The House is a little harder because that's based on population. But yeah, to have 10 Jewish senators by 1970 is pretty impressive.
Now,
Oh, yeah, Lieberman.
Lieberman, there you go.
Yeah.
That's it.
I
That's
was
it.
just gonna look it up.
By the way, Bernie Sanders is a Jew too. So, yeah. Okay, so, and like I said, there were other areas where Jews had a big influence. They became editors of newspapers, reporters, executives, professors, all right? And over time, okay, there were so many Jewish people in influential positions, yeah, and they were virtually in charge of the film industry in Los Angeles.
and the news now.
Yeah,
Financial.
financial,
That's a big
yeah.
Huge number, I think it's something like around 200 that were survivors of some of the camps in
Yeah.
Europe that formed a very strong group of stockbrokers that held sway over a lot of the major corporations.
Absolutely, absolutely. I quoted a guy concerning the Jewish influence on the film industry through the movies and television productions they financed. To quote one analyst of this, quote, fathers were strong, remember Leave It to Beaver? Families were stable, people were attractive, resilient, resourceful, and decent. That is the picture they presented of the American family. And most people think that particular cultural picture of the ideal American family may have been the Jewish contribution to our culture that had the biggest influence. Because everybody held this up as the ideal. Right? Think of the films that we used to watch. Ozzie and Harriet was the other one that came to my mind. Father knows best.
How long was this, the value that constituted
Norman leader.
So, yeah, so it did last quite a while. It lasted from the time most Americans started getting television sets up until things started to change in the mid-70s. Then the broadcast standards came down. You still can't say certain words on TV, right? Or
You get bleeped.
you get bleeped, right? But you can do pretty much anything else, yeah. The other thing I wanted to say is that another reason Jewish people flourished in America is because this country was built on the ideal that anybody, if they worked hard, could rise. That's been an American ideal from the very beginning, okay? The founders did not want any aristocratic system here, no king, no lords and ladies, none of that stuff. All men are created equal, said Thomas Jefferson, okay? So the idea was, doesn't matter who you are, here you can rise. All right? As an example, just simply because I'm more familiar with the Civil War than I am of other periods in American history, I used President Lincoln and General Grant. Did you know that both of them were born in poverty? In what was then considered the West, Kentucky and Ohio. Yeah, Kentucky for Lincoln, Ohio for Grant. They were born in poverty, and they both ended up in the White House. Okay, so America has been, and it's the reason why so many immigrants continue to come here. America is the place where you can come with nothing, and if you're with hard work and some luck, there's luck involved too, let's be honest about this, you can rise.
Yeah, we came with nothing.
Yeah?
But there was also part, not from America, but from Egypt. The money that we can take out of the country, or even the jewelry. Like I have my diamond ring, my husband had a diamond ring, and they said 2 diamond rings cannot go. One on. So my husband gave his to his brother.
Okay, so what was the influence of this on Protestants? Okay, over time, okay, so Protestants from the founding of America up until very recently, the vast majority of people in places of power came, whether they were practicing or not is another question, but they came from a Protestant background, okay? But as these waves of Jewish immigration led to Jewish flourishing and high levels of influence, Protestant people on Wall Street, people in academia, people in the entertainment industry, people everywhere got to know Jewish people, right? They got to know them. And they got to know them not as a stereotype, but as people just like them. Right? And it changed mainline Protestantism. It changed our attitude toward the Jews. Okay, mainline Protestants don't think Jews are going to hell. And let me give you an example from my career. Okay, a few years back, when I was still over at Faith in Castro Valley, there's a small, it's not really even a synagogue, it's a group, there's a small Jewish community there that is served by an intern, a rabbinical intern. And they asked me to come and speak at one of their gatherings after their worship they have fellowship just like we do. And they asked me to come and speak about Lutheran social ethics. That's what they were interested in, social ethics, just like the prophets, remember? Okay, so I got up there and I told them, I said, this is going to be foreign to you. I knew it would be, because for them, everything comes down to the Torah, the law, right? You do what God's will is as embodied in the law. That's the center of Jewish faith. And then I come along and I tell them Lutheran social ethics is based on faith in God's free love and grace given to us so that we in turn can demonstrate that same love we've received as an act of grace to other people. So faith is the foundation of Lutheran social ethic. And the rabbinical intern sat there and he said, afterwards he goes, faith, huh? That's new. Yeah, it was hard for him to understand that. It really was. But you see the difference there. What's going on here is that Jews and Christians are trying to understand each other rather than look at each other as enemies. Yeah. Okay? So it's had a big effect on Protestantism. And next week what we're going to do is, okay, we're going to look at the influence that foreign missions had on Protestantism in America. It was an enormous influence. And if you add that to the Jewish influence, you can begin to see why mainline Protestantism went in one direction and evangelical Protestantism went in another. Bye.